Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. After a U-turn on planned budget cuts by the Department of Education, will other senior civil servants now row back on finalising tough financial decisions? We'll hear from two organisations fighting against the cuts and asking questions about the decision-making process. As well as that, I've been talking to three newly returned councillors on our second biggest council. And joining me with his thoughts on all of that is John Manley, the political correspondent at the Irish News. A decision by the Department of Education not to cut a number of youth services and early years programmes has been given a broad welcome, but the move has led to questions being asked about the decision-making process in Stormont's other departments. Will permanent secretaries elsewhere now decide to roll back on finalising tough funding decisions too? Meantime, members of a United Nations Committee of Children's Rights experts are so concerned about the implications of the Secretary of State's budget that they've called on him to withdraw it and start again. With me to discuss the situation is the Chief Executive of Children in Northern Ireland, Pauline Leeson, and Fergal McFerrin from the Children's Law Centre. Welcome to both of you. Pauline Leeson, first of all, you've obviously welcomed the news from the Department of Education. You're now asking why other Stormont departments aren't taking the same approach as Mark Brown, the Permanent Secretary in Education.
Yes, Mark. I mean, we have been quite critical of the budget laid out by the Secretary of State in April. We said then that it would result in cuts in funding for children's services, which would impact disproportionately on children, young people and their families, and that's exactly what happened. We do welcome the U-turn by the Department of Education, but I think that while a lot of our members are breathing a huge sign of relief, obviously the department have recognised that the early intervention and prevention services that we provide are critical to improving the lives of children. I think it does raise some serious questions about how government departments are making these decisions. Now, for example, why is the school grant, holiday grant, not being ended? This was a scheme that was approved by the executive, and surely that means that it needs a ministerial decision as well. And I think it's not just education that these cuts are happening in. We also have very quietly been told over 100 organisations. We received notification last month about our core grant funding, including my own organisation, being ended in September of this year. So it really calls into question exactly what is happening here, who's making the decisions, how they're being made, and what impact they're going to have, particularly in our sector.
Can I just ask you, have you seen any evidence to suggest we could see other permanent secretaries in other departments starting to take a stance similar to that taken by Mark Brown at Education?
Well, I think what's happened here surely has implications for other decisions in other departments. Certainly the core grant funding, which we've been told is ending in September, that needs to be looked at again. These are services that have got quite a lot of impact. We work with children with disabilities, mental health services. It affects foster and adoption services, child protection, and families who are experiencing abuse. So I think that there is a clear disparity within departments about cuts being made, then being reversed, some cuts being kept on, and between departments where these decisions are still not being ended. So we really, really need to go back to the permanent secretaries. We want the politicians to be fully engaged and ask the senior officials what is going on here, and look at the impact, the disproportionate impact, not just on my sector, but also on children and young people.
Fergal McFerrin, you also welcomed the announcement yesterday from the Department of Education rowing back on some cuts. But like Pauline Leeson, you've made it clear you remain concerned both about the cuts that remain in place and how the decisions are being made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what this all exposes is the force of the Secretary of State setting a budget, the ultimate decision that's been made that's then flowing into the civil service, who are now trying to make decisions inconsistently without talking to one another. I think that's part of the reason why we've ended up with some departments doing one thing and others doing another. And that in itself is a concern, because the whole process has been a mess. There should have been full assessment of the impact of the budget before it was ever announced. And we now see the rolling back of programmes and interventions that aid the most vulnerable people in our society. And realistically, what we're seeing is cuts in education, in health, in communities that will all have impacts for the same groups of children and young people in vulnerable communities, where permanent secretaries clearly aren't talking to one another.
Yeah, but they would say, and they have said, of course, in letters that they've written, that they don't want to be in the situation they're in. They don't want to be making these decisions. They think that it is unfair on them, but they have responsibilities to make sure that they, as best they can, remain within the budget parameters that have been set. I mean, they are, do you accept, in an absolutely invidious situation here?
I accept that they are in an impossible position. What I don't accept is that the Secretary of State could set a budget and then walk away and say it's someone else's problem.
He seems to have done it, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it.
Well, and I think that speaks to how much care he actually gives to this place and its people. And I think that's why we've been so forceful in our criticism of him. He needs to show political leadership, because the budget he has set was a choice that he has made. And as much as the politics of where we are right now here is an issue, actually, the Secretary of State is the only show in town. OK,
well, let me just clarify that. We did invite Chris Heaton-Harris to take part in today's programme. He said no. A statement was issued. I should read it to you. It's a couple of sentences. Secretary of State is deeply disappointed, said an NIO spokesperson, to have had to set a budget for Northern Ireland in the absence of an executive. A locally elected, accountable and effective devolved government is the right way to govern Northern Ireland and to address the challenges its public services face. The decisions required of this budget, including where equality and human rights assessments are required, will continue to rest with the Northern Ireland departments. The government's grateful to the civil servants who, in the absence of an executive, will take these difficult decisions to keep their departments within budget while continuing to deliver public services. I mean, there are no great surprises in that. What do you make of it?
Well, if, as Chris Heaton-Harris has said, setting a budget was simply in the interests of good governance, I'd hate to see where we were if we were experiencing bad governance, because what he's done is not good governance.
What do you make of that statement, Pauline?
Well, I mean, we expressed deep concern when he put out the budget that that there would be a very negative impact, not just on our sector, but also causing harm to children and young people. I think there's an interesting point here in terms of the disparity between what decisions are made by ministers and what a permanent secretary can make. And I think the whole confusion around the reversal of cuts has highlighted that for us. Now, in terms of what decisions permanent secretaries want to make, certainly in our sector, we have felt that we've been undervalued. The infrastructure of our sector will be severely damaged by these decisions, particularly the core grant, and it will cause more harm to children and young people. So that's what local departments should be concerned about. OK, I
need to ask you, Fergal McFerrin, about the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, about its views on the impact of this budget. Your organisation's been working closely with it. Its findings are clear. It's so concerned about the implications of what's happening that it's calling on Chris Heaton-Harris to withdraw his budget allocations and start again. But that is not about to happen, is it?
Well, look, I think we need to put that in context. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have taken evidence from NGOs, from us, from human rights commissions and children's commissioners, as well as the government themselves. They've asked questions and had answers from all of us. And on the balance of things, an independent committee at the UN of children's rights experts from around the world are so concerned about the implications of the budget for Northern Ireland that they have intervened to say, withdraw it, start again, assess the impact in a way that is compliant with children's rights.
And is there any indication that anybody in the NIO is listening to that message?
Well, unfortunately not. We've certainly had no indication of that. But what I would say is this: it is incredibly important, because I'm not a politician, but if I was the Secretary of State and this had happened on my watch, I'd be deeply embarrassed at being called out like this. It is a farce.
He just keeps saying it's up to the locally elected politicians to get on with their work, do their job.
And I don't think we can accept for a moment that the Secretary of State has no power to do something. The idea that the man who is supposed to be the advocate for Northern Ireland around the cabinet table is somehow advocating for us right now is clearly not the case.
Pauline, is the solution to this situation the formation of a functioning executive at Stormont once again? Or is that an oversimplification of the issue, as some politicians claim, in particular, of course, those who remain opposed to Stormont coming back?
Well, Mark, I mean, everyone wants the restoration of the Assembly, politicians, the public. I think we're in a crisis now and we need to deal with this now. Certainly...
Not everyone does want that. I mean, the DUP went to the polls on the basis of absolutely advocating the opposite of that.
Yeah, well, I think that, we would all welcome the restoration of the Assembly. Certainly tomorrow I'll be asking the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Health to provide clarity on why he has made that decision to cut the core grant funding, and certainly based on what's happened with the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Education, where he said those decisions were beyond his remit and beyond his powers. I think that's what we need to be focusing on at the minute. OK, just a final quick one to you very quickly, Fergal McFerrin. Is the restoration of Stormont the silver bullet we need?
I think we need it, but in the absence of it, the Secretary of State has a duty to fulfil the rights of every child in Northern Ireland. It's
interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you both very much indeed. Let's hear from John Manley now from the Irish News, who's been listening to that. Again, the kind of frustration that we've just heard articulated by today's two guests is something we're now very familiar with.
Oh yes, it's on repeat almost every week on an endless loop. These stories about cuts, and I think it's important that we remind ourselves why we're here and why we're in this situation. The DUP only cropped up once in that conversation. They are looking to achieve sort of some concessions on very nebulous things about identity, while there are very real problems. The most vulnerable people, our young people, are suffering as a consequence of this. That's a more a medium-term solution. I think in the immediate term, it's important that the Secretary of State addresses this issue. The stuff from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is damning, a damning indictment of the current budget, and fair play to Mark Brown for standing up to that.
Do you think other permanent secretaries might now follow his lead and start to reverse their decisions?
I don't know. I'm unsure whether they're talking or they're working in tandem. Fergal suggesting they're not speaking to each other. And the messages coming out would suggest that as well. But I think they have indicated in that letter previously that they're unhappy with having to make these decisions. And I think if they dig their heels in, then they may force the Secretary of State to reconsider.
Although at the moment there's no sign, look, going through that statement which I read in full, no indication whatsoever he's about to change tack.
None at all. How sustainable that approach is, I don't know, really. It's an awful way to treat people.
And just very quickly, we know that there's a lot of talk in the background about this collective ask by the parties for more than £1 billion from the Treasury. And again, people are saying that sounds like a lot of money, but it would not sort out all our problems, even if the Treasury divvied up.
No, it wouldn't. And I think that the DUP is, I'll give them some credit on this occasion to say that they're looking at the structural issues and the longer-term problems in regards to funding. And I think they need to be resolved as well, rather than a mere handout. OK, John, for now, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk to you again a little bit later in the programme. Now, Northern Ireland's 462 new councillors are getting to grips with elected office after last month's election. The next Lord Mayor of Belfast will be Sinn Féin's Ryan Murphy, who at 28 will be one of the youngest councillors to take on the role of the city's first citizen tomorrow night. Meantime, I've been to the northwest to meet up with 3 newly elected councillors on Derry City and Strabane District Council. I asked them if they feel there's more responsibility on their shoulders at the moment because we don't have that other layer of government working effectively at Stormont.
In some cases, yes. And, even over the last year or so, or how many days that there has been not a functioning executive or an assembly, then a lot of the issues that we're discussing in council are departmental issues. They're things that should be discussed, reviewed and voted upon in the assembly chamber, or an executive decision made by the executive office. So we find ourselves, and let's remember, councillor is a part-time role, privilege as it is. You make decisions on the rates, the budget and policies and what services that you deliver. But at the moment we've taken on an awful lot of an additional burden which should be done in the Assembly, and sometimes we end up paying for it in council. So if we have a notice of motion or an initiative and we agree it, the 21 votes get through, then we need to find that funding from somewhere. and it's coming from the ratepayer, unless it's something that should be done at the executive, then it should come from the department. And that there is the biggest frustration I find at local council level because of that void of leadership, that void of responsibility, dereliction of duty, I say, in the Assembly. It's falling on councillors, it's falling on us to try and burden that. And we have stepped up to do it, and we'll continue to do it until leadership evolves or somehow comes through in the next number of months.
Does it frustrate you, Lillian, that the focus is on the councils because Stormont's not there, not working?
Absolutely. Council is the only arm of government that is functional right now, so it's natural for people to look at councillors to deliver for them. Unfortunately, we don't have enough powers, and certainly we don't have a budget that we can deliver all the services that people want. And council is a jigsaw puzzle. You know, you have a jigsaw puzzle. It's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. We will function better and deliver better if we had a functioning assembly. So it's very frustrating that people look at a council that doesn't have enough power. Sometimes I wish we did have more powers to be able to deliver for people.
Here's a point just to reinforce what Lillian has said there. The rate support grant that comes from the executive has been slashed by 75%. So when I speak with the Chief Financial Officer just before we reconvene council, we already have a deficit going forward of around 4 million. So we now have to work out, well, we've got a choice to make. The choice is, do you strike the rates at a higher rate than what we've done before? That's unsustainable. The second one is, well, what do you cut? And there's two key lines of what you take or what you cut from. Your statutory obligations, things like your refuge, your leisure centres, cemeteries, all of that core business that council is statutory responsibility to deliver. Then we've also got another column, which is your non-statutory outputs. So council have got great initiatives in business and the community to support people. But now, if the rate support grant is not put back to the same level of what we've budgeted the entire year for, then we've got a serious financial problem in our council.
When you hear that kind of problem outlined by Ryan, Sean, do you sometimes think, hang on a minute, why did I put my name forward again?
Yeah, look, I think it's been difficult for councillors for the period that the executive has been down, and in our opinion, I mean, look, the DUP just seem to be denying a nationalist First Minister. And I think that
is that how you see it? Because the DUP repeatedly denies that. Jeffrey Donaldson's been very clear. That's not anything to do with it, he says.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that if the vast majority of people here, no matter what party they're voting for, maybe not so much the unionist parties, but that's how they view it. Even people before profit supporters, I'm sure, can see that there's a basic injustice here, and a lot of this is contrived. But what it means is that there's more pressure on councils to try and do things. But if you look at what we're facing, the list of cuts every day grows increasingly worrying. So, there's the things that councillors are asked to help with: housing, potholes, dog fouling. All this is going to become an increasing challenge with less funding for the council. But then I also think that the council has to be an advocate for things like university expansion, for infrastructure expansion for Derry and for the North West. And that's become increasingly difficult because of these proposed cuts.
But it's difficult for you as the sole representative of a small party on a council to get any traction with that, because actually you have no authority over the kind of areas that you're talking about. The council has no authority over infrastructure, for example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the council already has agreed to, be an advocate and a campaigner for rail expansion, and we have to make sure that our officers actually follow through on that, and that we get the parties who've agreed to the motions in the council to see it expanded, they actually fight on it and campaign for it. And there's a long list of issues like that. But the council by
there's
itself,
a difference, Sean, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a difference between being an advocate for something and actually controlling the purse strings.
Absolutely, and that's the key thing. So, from our point of view, the entire council, and that means all the parties, and what we will be fighting for, and we will try to punch above our weight, and we won't be quiet even with one seat, and there's others in there as well. This tradition of green lighting through cuts, whether it's at the council level, Stormont level, that has to stop, because in our opinion, it only prolongs it.
You've all made very strong cases for the importance of council and the job that you have to do, that you've signed up for the next 4 years. I wondered, do you see being a councillor as an inevitable stepping stone towards a wider political career? I mean, Lillian, for example, would you like to run for the Assembly? Would you like to be up on the Hill making decisions on a bigger scale potentially in future, if Stormont ever comes back, of course?
Well, it's up to the people of Foyleside if they wanted me to. I think at the moment...
Well, you'd have to decide to put your name forward or not. And you would.
No,
Are you
the
saying
members
you
of
would?
the SDLP will make that decision when that time comes. But at the moment, I'm more focused on the work that the people of Foyleside have given me a mandate to do, and that is this council. And I don't think council is helpless, to be fair, when it comes to not just advocating, but also for delivering. Because when we use the ratepayers' money that we have innovatively, we can deliver for people within our city and district. Sometimes there may be accusation of some waste, and this is why, for me, I appreciate the process that we took when we were striking rates, because we had to look at where do we make savings, where can we afford to cut that it's not necessarily important for our community, and where can we invest. So I think that process was very helpful, and we will continue doing that. So there are things that we are able to do. I think for big infrastructure projects that we need, for capital projects, we absolutely need the Assembly, but we have a role.
You did very neatly sidestep my question there. You're an ambitious politician. You're not ruling out running for the Assembly at some stage in the future?
Well, if you need an answer, we'll go back to the SDLP members.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. I'll take that as a yes, that you'd like to. You've already run, and I think you would run again.
I can be a bit more bold, I suppose, on two counts. That the fact that I have ran before.
Yeah.
So
you can't deny it.
No, absolutely not. I could try, but it's not gonna wash. I would run again, and I think with the last 4 years, or especially the last 2 years, where I give more time to politics, I invested heavily on the kind of frontline end of politics, being in amongst people, communities, to really try and understand, well, what is politics? Because I never came from politics, so I didn't really have an appetite or a vision to say I'm going to be in politics.
So you've been on a steep learning curve.
Yes, absolutely, and I still am. Sometimes I fall, but I get back up. I admit my mistakes, and I be straight with people, and that resonates with them.
Right, you're going to be straight. I need to ask you this question. Mm-hmm. Why did you leave the DUP? They
knew my position on some like social issues a bit, probably a lot more moderate in some cases, and they didn't have a fundamental issue. They've got an openly gay councillor, Alison Bennington, and so I thought, okay, we're on a progressive transition. That didn't transpire, and locally, I'm not in the business of being a foot soldier anymore. I want to be a leader, especially in politics. So I was challenging their status quo and wasn't getting any movement. So after the first year, even in council, you could probably reflect now that I was voting very differently and trying to bring some of my then colleagues
because you're more socially liberal.
Yeah, in a way it was socially liberal, but pragmatic. It wasn't even about doing liberal policies or even things of constitutional issues. It was just pragmatism within council. But ultimately, these things got worse and worse. Edwin Poots, the Jeffrey Donaldson issue of leadership contest, and even things behind the scenes where I said to like local MLAs, did you or did you not sign that letter? And still, well, yes, I did. I said, why do you not just be straight with that person, ring them up and say, I'm going to challenge your leadership or I have lost confidence in you. So there's a few kind of personal, kind of almost like an ethos in my life that I would say, look, if you could do that to Arlene Foster, what are you not going to do to me?
So no regrets that you took what was a big decision, having just joined the party and having won a seat for a particular brand of unionism. To switch lanes is quite a big thing to do so soon after you'd really taken the step up to public life. But you don't regret that?
Personally, I don't regret it. But my conscience extended beyond that. I had to go and face the voters who put me in there under a DUP ticket. And I had to go back to the doors and say, look, I think being the advocate, being the pro-union voice, being the moderate, I think you should come with me. But I couldn't get their answer until last week, which I got, and they've stayed with me. Not only that, I've garnered more voters, new voters, voters who haven't voted in years, who've come back to be pro-union for the Ulster Unionist Party.
Sean, Ryan's made no secret of the fact that he would like to represent the Ulster Unionist Party at Stormont. You, of course, ran for People Before Profit for Westminster and the Assembly in the past. I mean, do you think you would like to bring your brand of politics to Stormont in future?
Well, if Stormont comes back, if there's another election,
Big if.
People Before Profit will definitely be standing a foil candidate, and I'll stand again if I'm selected by the party. We obviously take elections very, very seriously. We want to have a platform in local councils. We want to have a platform in Stormont. We've stood in Westminster. But look, it's not the be-all and end-all. I was a campaigner for decades before I stood in an election. I was involved in trade unions, all sorts of campaigns here in Ireland and in the United States where I lived. People like Maeve O'Neill or Eamon McCann don't give up on politics or activism simply because they don't get re-elected. And I think that that's very, very important, because there can be a lot of focus on individual politicians, but individual politicians don't make change. Change comes when large numbers of people bring about change, be that through activism and campaigning. You look at what brought about change here in the late 60s. It was a civil rights movement. We tried to speak to everybody in all communities about the need for dramatic change here. That's what brought about change. The issues that we're dealing with now, the scale of them is going to require, in our opinion, much more than getting people elected.
Councillors Lillian Senoy-Barr, Ryan McCready and Sean Harkin there talking to me on the front lawn at Ulster University's McGee campus. And you can hear that conversation in full on our Red Lines podcast, and that's available on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. And let's get a quick final thought from John Manley. John, it's interesting to hear from the councillors about the added responsibility they feel while Stormont remains in hiatus.
Yes, well, I think that's a perception rather than a reality. They're three very capable elected representatives, and possibly, will go on to better things, as they say. I think, I don't doubt their desire to affect change, but I think that they would be better suited at a higher level of administration in Stormont, because I don't think that the councils, as they characterise them, quite have that capacity to change.
At least the councillors are there doing their job, though.
That's true. And they are filling this vacuum that is occurring at Stormont, but I don't think that's a long-term solution, giving those powers back to councils.
Just a quick word. Your reaction to Professor Brendan O'Leary on The View, his comments on a border poll, official reaction from unionists, actually quite low-key.
Well, there was something for everything in what Brendan O'Leary was saying. He gives justification to unionists' lack of engagement with the debate around Irish unity and a border poll. I think that's a short-term and medium-term solution, but in the long term, it wouldn't serve unionist interests to not engage in this debate.
It's interesting to hear everything set out by him in the way that it was, though, briefly, isn't it?
Oh, he's very sober, very cogent. He strips it of the rhetoric, and lays it out as it should be.
OK, John, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. As ever, that's all we've got time for today. I'll be back with The View on Thursday night here at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One. Until then, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.